Welcome to this webinar on Mudbox 2015 in the Entertainment Creation Suite. And really what that means is Mudbox 2015 and how it relates to Maya in a number of ways, and how we can use Maya as a hub. And this goes for a number of things, not just geometry or textures or lights or cameras. This also goes for things such as blend shapes, as well as like a volume texture export UI and some of the things that are new in 2015. The other thing that I wanted to do here is not just cover Mudbox 2015, but include some of the features that were introduced in Mudbox 2014 extension, and has some interesting features related to retopologizing models with asymmetry and so on. So the first slide here that we have is related to the new stuff, and you can see there's an inset there that deals with organization of paint layers and sculpt layers in Mudbox. Some of the things that are listed there on the left, you can see organizing sculpt and paint layers into groups allows you to create, merge groups, control the visibility of groups, of course, but also export groups in the case of paint layers. Now, the first item listed there on the left is enhanced blend shape interop with Maya. So having the ability to be able to create multiple blend shape nodes in Maya, each of those nodes can contain multiple morph targets. When you send those multiple blend shape nodes either individually or in time or all at once, will create sculpt groups in Mudbox, and so each sculpt group will be named after the name of the blend shape node in Maya. And then after that, in Mudbox, if you decide to add the sculpt layers to any of those blend nodes or blend shape nodes, you can do that and push that back into Maya, and Maya will automatically update. The next set of features here is being able to pick from a current paint layer. So picking or sampling a color from a paint layer can be a bit of a pain when you have like 10 layers sitting on top of each other, and you really just want to sample layer number 4. You could just sample that directly off the layer by setting the option for picking the color to current layer. We also have, and I'm going to get into this in the demo, so I won't get into it too much right now, but there's an enhanced interop for Maya regarding both PTEX and multi-tile UV textures. So multi-tile UV textures are still kind of a predominant way of working for a lot of television and film pipelines, and so this is something that we needed to address on both the Maya and the Mudbox side, and I'll show you what's there in terms of new tools. We also have some new menus related to directly updating current scene textures, as well as being able to export along with the camera the image plane, and it actually matches what you have in Maya. So you send it from Maya, you kind of get what you would expect in Mudbox. We also have some smaller improvements that I'll get to in the demo. We worked a little bit more on the caliper tool, which now has segments, can stay visible as you're working with different tools. It can also stick to the surface as you're sculpting. And we're supporting Intel HD Graphics 4000. So let's move on to the next slide here, where we're talking a little bit about 2014 extension. There was a make symmetrical feature that allowed you to simply flip geometry from one side to the other side when you're dealing with scans and you're dealing with a lot of dirty data. If there are details on a part of the model that are missing on the other side, you can quickly flip that to the other side, and I'll show you a demo on that. There's also some interesting stuff related to maintaining symmetry with the retopology. So being able to maintain symmetry obviously is very important as you're retopologizing your mesh, and it's also important to be able to do that on asymmetrical meshes. Islands are kind of a byproduct of things like scans, for example, or some of the things that we do with reality capture. Lots of extraneous data is generated. Being able to retopologize that without having to clean that up first can be a huge advantage, so that we can deal with the cleanup later and just really focus on the model that we want to work with. It's much easier to retopologize something and then grab the hero element or the hero geometry that you really want to work with, export that, and leaving all the islands behind, import that, and now you have a pretty clean piece of geometry. Of course, the caliper tool was introduced at that point as well. So I usually like to kind of insert some examples of people's work that have used Mudbox for some interesting ideas. Here's some images of very different styles of characters, for example. Here's some characters that have quite a bit of geometric control on the surface, which can fairly easily be done in Mudbox. Some props, obviously, or game assets such as these. or photorealism. As you can see in this bird, this is a beautiful example of what can be done in Mudbox. Another example of what used to be the splash screen of a realistic portrait, and a modeler who built himself. On the left, the larger image is the actual CG asset, where the photo is on the bottom right. Another example where Maya is used to kind of generate the hair for a Mudbox model. And here's something of a more finished final result. Of course, Mudbox is used for other purposes as well, and I'd like to go through some of that. I taught a workshop for Yale School of Architecture, and what they wanted to be able to do is use Mudbox for the development of wall tiles, and the kinds of things that then can be prepped for printing or any kind of milling. So in this case, you can see there's a CNC machine kind of milling out a sandwich laminate set of planks that then is turned into an interesting kind of three-dimensional panel. And everybody in this course was doing their own kind of thing, and I think these panels ranged quite a bit in size, but they're all very large, like 3 to 5 feet or so. And you can see here's some examples of some of the final panels that were generated in this workshop. So from reality, this is another aspect of where Mudbox can be useful, in that we can start with reality and take photography, or in the case of Recap Pro, there's a Reality Capture Pro version of the software that allows you to process photography as well as laser scans. What that will let you do is, if you're using photography, for example, which is what was used here, you can upload these images to the cloud, and within a given amount of time you will get back an asset, which is a very large set of triangles that you can then stick in Mudbox for retopology purposes. The other thing obviously you can do is go the opposite direction, start a Mudbox and build a model that then can be printed in something, or through something like a form printer or like a MakerBot. So with that, let's go ahead and jump into the demo. On the left here we have Maya, on the right we have Mudbox, and this asset right here is the one that I'm going to be working with for a little bit to show you a number of new features both on the Maya and the Mudbox side. So the first thing here is the UV editor. If we take a quick look at the UV editor, you can see that we have multiple UV tiles. We have quite a bit of UV shells that are packed quite nicely. But in this case you can see that we're covering 3 tiles in the U direction and 1 tile in the V direction. So one of the things that are new here is this shader that will also show up on the surface. You can see what it looks like on the surface in 3D, but it will also show up in the UV texture editor. If I maximize this, you can see that we get the shader to kind of show a blue and red color range. This is a compression shader, and so if I wanted to go in and say, let's look at one of the shells here. Where it's blue, it's starting to stretch out. Where it's red, it's starting to compress. Where it's white, it's just right. So if I go in here and select some UVs and then maybe turn on soft select, and by the way, if you wanted to, you can jump into a soft select mode, and then you can set this to like a volume, so that it allows you to spill over into other shells. So as I scale this, you can see that I can incorporate the scaling or whatever translation operation I'm applying to that shell onto other shells. Let's leave it set to surface, so we're just affecting the shell that we're working on. And I can then go into scale and, for instance, scale this up. As I scale this up, you can see the color starting to shift. And if I select a larger area, maybe scale that up, you can see that color starting to shift more dramatically. And that way we can kind of take out some of the stress that we see in terms of the color coding. Let's turn this off. The other thing that we could do here is turn on the color coding of the tiles. You can see that we have a U1V2, a U2V2, a U3V2, etc. And so this is something that we want to have come across into Mudbox correctly. And we also want to be able to go from Mudbox back to Maya correctly. So as I'm generating more texture information, I want to be able to make sure that this comes into Maya the right way. So let's go ahead and turn this off. Let's go ahead and take a look at this model, and let's maximize Maya for a second. If I jump into the Hypershade window and find one of the textures, let's graph this real quick. Down here we have a bunch of textures related to color. You can see that each of these nodes are set up with a layer texture. If I grab it, you can see all the textures inside of it. And say let's pick this one. When you look at the texture node itself, you can see that you get a number of new options. So first thing you notice here is that there's a token designation of multiple tiles. So there's an indication here of what tile this texture is associated with. Then you can decide on what tiling method you want to use. Do you want to use Mudbox, which is the first tile in Mudbox is basically U1V1, which is the same way Maya works. Or do you want to use something like ZBrush, where the first tile is 0, or UDIM, a 4-letter designation that's being used in Mari. Or if you wanted to go ahead and assign an explicit tile, so you can go ahead and designate what tile you want this texture to be associated with. Now, because when you're dealing with multiple UV tiles, and let's say you're dealing with 10 layers of textures, and each layer is a 4K texture, the amount of data that has to go back and forth between Mudbox and Maya can add up very quickly. So instead of showing all the textures by default, you can go ahead and generate a preview, which is that red button right there. If I click on that, it would generate a preview for just this one texture on the surface, and you can go ahead and select what quality that's going to be displayed at. Let's go ahead and make sure that we set this back to Mudbox. In this case, what I want to do is I want to just load all textures for all tiles, and it's going to take a little bit of time. So I'm going to go in here and say regenerate all UV tile preview textures. So this setting you can find inside of Viewport 2.0 settings. As soon as I click that, it's going to process all textures for all tiles, and I'm going to see them on the surface. You could, if you wanted to, turn on clamp texture resolution, and then clamp your texture resolution to maybe something like 1K or 2K, so that what we're seeing in the viewport is going to be less than what we're sending to Mudbox. I'm going to turn on the image plane next and send that to Mudbox as well. So if we go to Show, Image Planes, there it is. I want to go ahead and select this asset right here and send it to Mudbox. So we're going to go in and drag this over to the left and send this to Mudbox as a new scene. This is going to drop not just the camera, but the image plane as well, of course the mesh and all the textures into Mudbox. So Control Up will ask you, displaying many textures may consume available video memory and degrade performance. I want to show it anyways because I have enough memory here. And so Control Up will actually load those textures, and you should be fine at that point. So some of those mesh errors I may have to fix at some point that we have to run through Maya's cleanup tool. But for now, we're in Mudbox and we have what we want. I'm going to go ahead and kind of take a closer look at it on the Maya side as well as the Mudbox side. You can see that it came in exactly the way we want. In the background, you can see the image plane on the Mudbox side is kind of muted, and that's because the visibility is set to 0.5. And the reason why we do that is so that if you have other assets that were sent to the Mudbox either inadvertently on purpose, they may actually end up behind the image plane. You can actually see through that image plane. So let's go ahead and jump into the object list, find the image plane, and increase the visibility to 100%. And let's just maximize Mudbox at this point. We can also scale this to kind of fit the view, and so we have a model in the context of a background in Mudbox. So the next step is to start working with some of the paint layers. So under Specular and Diffuse, let's go ahead and open up this paint layers window a little bit. Once I get to this point, I'd like to just check my UV tiles real quick. So let's jump into the UV view and you can see what they look like. And using the paint layers on the right, I can quickly select a paint layer, and you can see how that paint layer displays in the UV view. Right now, you just have to update this by making this invisible or not. You can do this per layer, or what I do is just quickly turn on and off the visibility of the diffuse channel, and now you can just go ahead and switch between the individual layers to see what's on these layers. So for example, if I go to the stencil layer, there's some stenciling information here that's sitting under these shells right in here. So now we get a proper update on all these layers. I'm going to do the same thing over here, turn it on, turn it off. This works much faster too, and we can now see the individual spec layers inside of the spec channel. Let's go back to our 3D view, and I'm going to first create some sort of or stencil some sort of detail on the surface here by jumping into one of my paint tools. I might want to go in and add something like nose art in here, where we stick that right on the nose right there. Use that same projection brush to rub the details in that way. There too, we want to have it show up on the other side. Maybe hide this for now. I'm going to use that same stencil and a paint erase brush to kind of go in there and drop down just kind of make it integrate with that jet. Let's turn off the stencil there. The next thing I'd like to do, so these are done on the body of the vehicle, and so now I want to go in here and select something like this, and I want to stick this on the wing, and we'll make it fairly large, kind of crossing over some part lines, something like that, and we'll use the projection brush. Mirroring is turned on for this as well, so it's going to show up on the other side right there. And so if I wanted to see what that looks like in the context of my UV view, I'm just going to make sure that layer is painted. You can see right there that texture shows up over there, and then over here we get our nose art and our decal showing up on both sides for multiple shells. Let's go back to our 3D view and turn off our stencil. The next step I'd like to take is, or the next feature I'd like to show you is the color picking stuff. This is the red color right here. So if I want to pick the color off of this layer, ignoring that decal, I can click on the decal and it's going to pick yellow. But if I do this again, setting this to current layer, and same thing right there, you can see it's going to pick a brown reddish kind of color. Anyway, so that's kind of one of the things that can be helpful in terms of not having to turn layers on or off as you're sampling colors off your layers. So in this case, I have this red layer. I'm going to go ahead and just delete this. We don't really need it. I'm going to go ahead and select the decals. That's fine. We want to keep those. This one we don't need, so we're going to go ahead and delete that as well. And in this case, we have a spec at the very top, and we have this one right here. I'm going to go ahead and delete this too. I'm going to create a new spec channel that's based on the color of the body. So let's duplicate this, move this into the spec channel. There we go. We get a nice blue color. I'm going to do an adjust color on this, and we'll make this very quick. You can see I want to kind of pick up an aqua color in that spec, and then maybe increase the contrast there a bit, like that. So this is what I want in Maya, or I might want to go ahead and select something like a linear light. That's kind of a cool one to pick. So I want to have this come across into Maya, where the textures get exported from Mudbox, and they can be put anywhere you want. So at this point, what I'd like to do is select the model and get into the sending prefs. So we go send to Maya, preferences. I can turn on the send paint layers separately. If they're sculpt layers, I'm going to go ahead and flatten the sculpt layers. We don't really need the sculpt layers there. So once that preference is set up, I can decide to do one of two things, or one of a number of things, but really two main things. I can export all the paint layers. If I don't need the mesh in Maya, if I just need the paint layers, I can start using this new UI, and that new UI exists in different places, where you can send, just for the selected model, which is the ship, we can send all the textures in a new format. You know, these may all be 8-bit PNGs, but let's say I want to send them as 8-bit JPEGs, or TIFFs, or EXRs. All those formats are built into this, and I can go in and just select whatever format I want. I can then go in here and eliminate some of these paths. There's always one path that's showing, which is the default path, and then there's a path or multiple paths that I can add. So in this case, I'm going to add a path, and I'm going to define a directory. I have a temp directory set up, and inside of that temp directory, I have a folder called all. It's just going to do a large data dump into the all directory. We'll say choose. There it is, and we can now deal with the naming of these textures. I also want to name this path all, so that we can, if we want to, turn this on, this override all paths. And you can see that for all channels and for all paint layers, they all go to the directory called all. So they all get flattened and sent to a single directory. So if you're testing and you have kind of a scrap directory that you use for this kind of thing, you can set it up this way and not worry about it too much. Then you can also deal with the naming convention. So in this case, you can use the names of the actual paint layers as they are, or you can override all these names with a naming template that's essentially the channel, which is the material in the channel, the group, which is the material, the channel, and the group, or a layer, which is the material, the channel, and the layer. This is just one example of one way of doing it. The other way of doing it is to send the model to Maya as well. So if I say add selected to current scene, I'm going to get the same UI. And in this case, I'm going to go ahead and reset this up because you do want separate control over this. So maybe as you're exporting paint layers, you might want to go to one directory. As you're exporting the mesh with the paint layers, you might want to have all paint layers go to different directories. So in this case, I'm going to go ahead and set this up to go into my temp directory. And I'm going to select the diffuse channel, the diffuse folder there. So you can see it's set up here as diffuse. And let's say we'll call this diffuse. The next one is going to be in temp, which will be my spec channel, and we'll call this spec just to make it obvious. And the third one is going to be incandescence. I'm going to select incandescence. There it is, and we'll type in ink. And maybe the last one is something that goes not to the all directory. Maybe we want to go directly to the source images directory for Maya. So we have them located inside of a Maya project. So we can go to Maya 2015, source images, choose that. And you can see that. And then we can call this source images. Once this is set up, we can obviously have everything go to source images. You can see how all that reflects what my override looks like, which override is turned on. Override, you can only have one override at a time here, obviously. Or you can go in and say, let's turn this off and we'll assign more localized kind of directions. So for the diffuse channel, we can specify to send all these to the diffuse directory. For the second one here, we're going to go ahead and send this all to spec, the spec folder. And the last one, we're going to go ahead and do this for ink. And so you can send anything anywhere you like, depending on how you have it formatted. Once this is set up, we can do a large export of everything at the same time. Before I do that, and I can just close this window, not really worry too much, because that's all saved with the Mudbox scene. I'm going to go ahead and turn this off, and we're now going to go in and send this to Maya. So you can see that we can send this. It'll send the geometry as well as the textures. Everything is going to the right place. And once it shows up in Maya, we will have to, again, because the system will recognize that what's coming across are multiple tiles for my UV textures, and so it needs to do another refresh. So there's the mesh. I can go back into Viewport 2.0 and regenerate this. And so in this case, we're going to have a blue version of this ship. The red version I hid, and all the textures are being read in from the directories that I set up from within Mudbox. So this is it's kind of a nice comprehensive tool, that texture export UI from Mudbox, to get everything to go where I need it to go, depending on what workflow I'm dealing with. I might be dealing with a layout department, I might be dealing with production, I might be dealing with different scenarios, and so textures need to be able to go to different places. And so here it is. There's our vehicle, and there's our vehicle on the Mudbox side. Let's go ahead and deselect this. One of the other things that I wanted to show you here real quick is the temp directory that I created, where you can see the all directory with all the textures flattened, or not flattened, but the same naming convention here. They're all JPEGs, 8-bit JPEGs, all kind of in a single directory for all channels, so diffuse, incandescence, and specularity. Then here we have a diffuse directory with all of our diffuse textures, all tiles, all textures, same for specularity, and same for incandescence. So let's move on to the next aspect of my Mudbox interop, which is blend shapes. So here we're back in Maya with a character and a series of blend shape targets, morph targets, that we kind of want to bring into Mudbox as a series of sculpt layers. So we can apply corrections inside of Mudbox and then bring those back to Maya. So let's start off by setting up a blend shape. So I'm going to go ahead and select a series of targets and the original head and open up a blend shape creation window. And we'll call this blend shape BSO1. Once that's created, let's look at the outliner layout and swap out the outliner for the blend shape window. And in this case, we can show this either as a layout where we have all the sliders oriented horizontally, or we can go in here and change the orientation to vertical. So once that's done, we can kind of take a look at our main character here. Let's drop into that a little bit closer and just kind of test that, see that's working. And so we have this working. I want to send this into Mudbox now. So let's go ahead and grab the head and send this to Mudbox, and let's go ahead and minimize this here real quick, or kind of have it occupy half the screen space. Open up these windows a bit too, and then send this to Mudbox. So as we send this as a new scene, it's going to come into Mudbox. It does a geometry check if there are any errors on the mesh. We have some vertex valances. We're going to go ahead and turn these errors off. We don't really care about these. And then what I want to do is I kind of want to take a look at what this does first. So on the Mudbox side, we get one node called BSO1. That's the sculpt group, which is the name of the blend shape. So every next blend shape node will be a new sculpt group on the Mudbox side, and inside of it we get our sculpt layers, which are essentially edits that are applied to the model. So we can go from 0 to 100 that way. If we turn this on and then turn this switch on or off, you can see that we can turn this on or off. We can also blend a couple of these layers together, something like that, and then turn the layer group, the sculpt layer group, on or off the actual blend shape node. So these values for these channels are actually stored in the file that gets sent back to Maya, so that we get the same update, we get the same values on these sliders as soon as we send it back. So let's select the model. We're going to go send to Maya. Let's go into preferences first and make sure that we are flattening the paint layers. We don't really need complicated layer textures. We just need some sort of reference texture. We also need to go ahead and turn on export sculpt layer groups on current mesh as Maya blend shapes. Okay, and if I send this to Maya now by updating the current scene, we'll see the edits come across. We can set a path for the textures. I'm going to go in and set the textures to send the textures to the all directory. So we'll say choose. Very good. We'll call this all. And OK that. So once that's sent in, you can see that all these sliders will adjust to whatever we have it set to in Mudbox. There we go. And there's our facial expression. So the next thing I want to do is I want to go in and kind of consider not just the new blend shape nodes, but I also want to send across the eyes, so I can actually sculpt new morph targets around the eyes. So we'll select the new targets, or the additional targets, and the base, and bring up the blend shape creation window where we're creating another blend shape, and add that to the list. And let's go ahead and send that to Maya first, or to Mudbox first. Select the head, file, send to Mudbox. In this case, I don't want to send it as a new scene. I just simply want to update the current scene. And when we do that, it'll ask for the same thing. We'll go ahead and turn off the mesh errors. You can see that it adds the second BSO2, the second blend shape node, with the additional morph targets. So in this case, I can turn this up, dial this up. We have a left and a right smile kind of thing. We can also go in and say let's add a new layer by adding another sculpt layer, and maybe we'll call this ironic or something like that, and grab a sculpt tool. And in this case, I want to actually go back to Maya, add the eye, so we're not doing anything that tears the geometry away from the eyes. So let's go ahead and grab the eyes and send this to Mudbox by adding that to the current scene. Once that comes in, we can now sculpt around these using the ironic sculpt layer. We'll grab the grab brush, we'll turn off mirroring. I'm going to increase the size of this a little bit and maybe move this up. We can kind of create a tighter fit this way. Move this up a bit, kind of like that. Maybe lift this mouth, the corner of his mouth, maybe the middle of his mouth as well. Maybe lower the nostril on one side, raise it on the other side. Lower his eyelid on this side. You get the idea. Obviously, you want to spend a little bit more time on this than I do, but you get the idea as far as concept. So let's go ahead and select the model again. We're going to send this back to Maya by updating the current scene. And as soon as I do that, you'll see this new expression, the additional slider, and the value for that slider come into Maya. And it's set to 100%. I might want to dial this down a bit. Okay, so that's kind of a little bit on the interop between Maya and Mudbox when it comes to bringing across blend shape targets as well as blend shape nodes. So the next thing we'll get into is a little bit of the symmetry and asymmetry, asymmetrical model, symmetry on asymmetrical models, as well as retopologizing. But we'll start off with a simple symmetry exercise. So here we're back in Mudbox, and we're looking at this skull that could have been a scan, and if it is, you can see that in some cases you get very dirty geometry like this, where just big chunks are missing. If you want to go ahead and see inside the model and get a better sense of what the complete mesh looks like, let's turn on both sides for that, rather than seeing through. And in this case, obviously, I want to be able to copy the left side of this skull to the right side by selecting the model, and then through the mesh menu get into make symmetrical, where we can select the mirror left to right or right to left menu set. So in this case, make sure that the check mark is sitting on the side that you want to copy. So we'll say right to left, and then copy this across. Now, if you had some rotational value for this model, you need to be able to do this obviously in world space as well as object space. So if you had some rotation or an orientation change to this model, you can turn on the local axis and it'll do the X mirroring across in local space. So we're going to go ahead and leave this set to X and say make symmetrical. It's not going to take that much time, and as soon as you do that, you can see that we get a nice little seam there in the middle. And if I deselect the model, you can see that in this case we get an axis of symmetry. And so what's nice about this is that because I've mirrored one side to the other side, and I do have an axis of symmetry, I can select this model and now go back into my retopologize menu, and let's create an operation name 01 output, put mesh name 01, and maybe have a base mesh, a target base face count of 1,000. Face uniformity, I'm going to drop that down just a little bit, close to 1. I just want to transfer the sculpt to detail, and we're going to retopologize. I'm going to do this on the fly, so as this happens, you can see on the bottom left it's reducing the mesh, regenerating the normals, creating the new topology. So once we get that back, we get a quad based mesh. And what's nice about this mesh is that once it gets to that point, we'll have a number of levels we can step through, or we can add additional levels to sculpt more detail on top of it. Okay, so the model is finished retopologizing. You can see the mesh is nice and dense. We get about 3.5 million polys or so, and I can start to step down to the lower levels in the geometry by just using the page down button. And in this case, if you look at the bottom right, you can see that we have 5 levels. We're at the active level of 4, and we can turn off the wire here too to kind of see the shift in details as we're going up and down through the hierarchies. So we can add another level if we wanted to add more detail, but in this case I think this will suffice. But anyway, it's a good example of how you can go from a scan, for example, of nothing but triangles all the way up to a quad-based model where we can add multiple levels. So here we're back in Mudbox, and what I'd like to do next is focus a little bit on the features that deal with symmetry, asymmetry, and being able to retopologize meshes while maintaining a symmetrical topology. So let's take a look at this model over here, and what we have is a mesh that's relatively low in resolution, and it is symmetrical, and that's really because that was the easiest way to build this, is to just kind of mirror across an axis and get the topology to be the same. But we want to put this character into some sort of pose. Now before we do that, let's go ahead and take a look at some of the symmetry tools. If I select the sculpt brush, you'll see that there's a mirroring function in here with a bunch of axes listed. X, Y, and Z are world space axis, and because my character aligns with world space right now, I could use that. So if I were to touch on the model here real quick and select one of these axes, you get a preview plane as to across which plane it mirrors across. If you've rotated or changed the orientation of your model in space, you may have to use a local X, a local Y, or a local Z mirroring plane, because that's really the only way to get your sculpts to go across to the other side correctly. So let's go ahead and set this to local X. There's a hotkey for this as well. So if I don't want to use this, I can use Shift Alt X or Y or Z, depending on which plane I want to mirror across. And it'll kind of flag that little window there that says, okay, mirroring is turned on, so you know you're in mirroring mode. There's a primary brush and there's a secondary brush. You can see the secondary brush is just a dot. The primary brush actually has the circle around it. And as I sculpt into the pectoral muscles, the shoulder, the arm, the upper arm, the lower arm, it's all mirroring correctly. And if I get into the finger there too, you can see that it's properly mirroring across the local X plane. Now what I'd like to do next is kind of pose my character into some sort of position that doesn't allow me to use this kind of mirroring. So what we'll do is we'll jump into the pose tool, select the create joint tool, and create some sort of a joint with a weighting scheme in the upper arm. And if you want, you can go to weighting and say I want to kind of weigh this in the back of the model to blend it in better with, let's say, this back muscle here. So I can add some weighting in this area, just paint it. You can also subtract it. So if I go in here and hold down Control, I'm subtracting from the weighting, kind of creating a softer transition. I might want to subtract some of the weighting, the existing weighting that was created when I first created the joint as well. But when I'm done, I can then jump into a pose tool and click drag to kind of reposition this. I can use the middle mouse button to move the joint, left mouse button to rotate across it. So once I get to a point that works for me, I can go in here, maybe do the same thing for the elbow, jump into a posing tool and kind of rotate that up, and maybe do the same exact thing from like a top view where we grab a joint tool and we'll click drag this in the wrist and maybe give it a little bit of a rotation this way. We'll move it over a little bit, and that's kind of where I want to be. So this is the asymmetrical pose now. If I look at the mesh in wire mode, I can now go in and define the axis across which I want to mirror. So in order to do that, we have to go ahead and jump to the base mesh. I also like to, under Windows, Preferences, set this to render selected by face. And that's under render, and the reason why I do that is because when I select one of my selection tools, the face selection tools, I'm going to make this very small, turn off mirroring. Let's go ahead and turn it off. Mirroring is turned off, so I can select one face at a time. I want to pick that one and that one, and the reason why I pick these two, or you can pick any two across this center line, is that you want to find the center line, pick any two faces on either side, on both sides of that center line, and then go to edit and define this as the topological axis. So set topological axis or Control V works as well. And at that point, we can go ahead and jump back up in resolution, and we can deselect all of that and get into a mirroring option called tangent. So as soon as I turn on tangent, I can now go ahead and sculpt onto, oh, we're still in selecting mode, so let's go ahead and select the sculpting tool here and get into maybe the chest, the upper arm. And you can see that that is mirroring across correctly into the forearm, all the way down into the finger. If I touch the thumb on his right side, you can see that I'm getting correct mirroring across to the other side. So what's required for this is defining the topological axis, and that's something I want to be able to maintain. So if I have a mesh that's far more posed with a more dramatic difference between one half and the other half, for example, if I turn off the troll and turn on troll pose, this one I spend a little bit more time on trying to get this to look like this. And so this is a full body asymmetry where we want to be able to not just sculpt across to the other side, we also want to be able to retopologize and then continue to be able to sculpt across on the new topology. And that new topology may have more levels, fewer levels. It may have more resolution. It may have, very different characteristics. So let's go ahead and jump down in resolution to the base mesh. I'm going to go back to my face selection mode and select a face on either side of that center line. We'll set the topological axis, same as what we did just before. Jump up in resolution. And we can continue to sculpt on this, or we can go ahead and go to Mesh, retopologize, and create a new operation. And in this case, what I want to do is go ahead and give it a name. Usually it might be a good idea to give the operation name and the output mesh name it's a similar name. Usually I name these the same, but then I add something that that reflects as to what specs I was using inside of this retopology operation. For example, I might want to set this to 200. And I might want to drop the face uniformity to 0.9, making it easier for faces to get to a certain amount of detail on the surface, which is really what it's going for when you turn on sculpted detail. When you turn on sculpted detail, what you're requiring it to do is basically replicate the detail on the surface in the retopologized surface. So by dropping the face uniformity, it may not have to create as many levels on top of each other to be able to get to that surface detail. So it's actually a way to kind of limit the amount of geometry that you're generating. Other things that you can bring across is sculpt layers if you have any. Of course, paint layers if you have any. Curves that you may have to guide the topology, or posing information, which is something that we've used to kind of pose this character in the pose that it is right now. So the weighting scheme, as well as the rig, the joints that you built in Mudbox. Or if you build those joints in Maya and then bring them into Mudbox, that works as well. That information will also be brought across to your new retopologized model if you were to do this and turn this on. So let's go ahead and look at this down here under symmetry. There's an option in here that normally does not show up. It only shows up if it sees the mesh in the system in your scene that had a topological axis defined that was defined by having two faces selected on both sides of that axis. Once that's done, you will get this new option called based on source topology. So symmetry based on source topology, which is exactly what I want to turn on. So once this is turned on, we can retopologize. This takes a few minutes. I already have one that is done that I'm going to show you, which was done exactly this way. And so if we close this real quick, and I'll turn this off and I'll turn on the retopologized mesh, you can see that the new mesh is an exact replica of the old mesh, but it's quite a bit more dense. So you can see that by only dropping the face uniformity to 0.9, it probably had to create more levels to be able to get to where I want it to go. So in this case, we get a pretty dense mesh. We can go ahead and jump down. Let's go ahead and select this. The previous mesh only had 2 levels. This mesh has 5 levels. If you look at the bottom right, you can see active 5, highest 5. We're looking at about 2.5 million polys. So kind of a medium resolution mesh. And I can jump down, jump down, jump down in resolution until we get to the very base mesh, level 0, or we can go back up. So in this case, what I'd like to be able to do as well, let's go ahead and turn this up to the very highest level. We're going to go ahead and select the sculpt brush and maybe sculpt on the surface. Maybe I want to add more detail by adding more levels with this new topology. And again, if you wanted to use curves to kind of guide the topology, that can be done too. So we can go into the arm, into the forearm, and then in this case we can go all the way into the thumb, and you can see that that symmetry is maintained. That topological axis that we set is maintained as well. So if we sculpt in the toes, the knees, the arms, the fingers, wherever it is that we go, with that tangent mirror turned on, we should be able to replicate everything and anything on either side of that new retopologized model. Continuing on with Mudbox, here I have a model of a character head that I'd like to dress up with some additional details. I also might want to go in and maybe adjust the resolution. I might want to add more detail. I might want to add things that require things like dynamic tessellation. So for example, this mesh right here, nothing but triangles, and there's a good reason to sometimes stick with triangles. There's not always a reason to have to go to quadrangles and go through a retopology operation. It really all depends on what the purpose is of the mesh. If you need it to be a character that deforms, then generally quads are a good way to go, because it allows you to take advantage of things in Maya like creasing, of open subdiv, of a number of things that can be very beneficial to the performance of your characters in 3D. In the case of static meshes, that might not be required at all. So in a lot of cases we can just use triangles and be perfectly okay. So with this, I want to send this mesh to a place where I can actually dress it up a little bit and maybe add some ears, for example, or horns, or whatever it is. So basic head here. I'd like to select this model and export this as an OBJ, and we're going to go to Meshmixer. So I'm going to transport this into my 2015 directory and call this head original. So we'll go ahead and save this and overwrite this. And the next step I'd like to get into is import this into Meshmixer. So Meshmixer is an application that allows you to interface with printers. It allows you to prep meshes. It allows you to sculpt. It allows you to do all sorts of interesting things to sculpt your mesh to add more details. The name of the software is actually named after a feature that we're going to be using here in just a second. By importing the 01 head original, we get the mesh to display in Meshmixer. Same hotkey here to be able to display the wire. So let's go ahead and deselect this in Mudbox, and we can get a side-by-side view of the actual mesh. And I might want to go in and look at some of my sculpt brushes. So we have some sculpt brushes in here, which are either surface-based or volume-based. If you go into your brush library here, you can see that you get a whole bunch of brushes related to dragging or flattening or creating spikes on the mesh. You can smooth in a number of ways. There's a bubble smooth, a shrink smooth, a robust smooth. And there are also some tessellation controls. A brush that allows you to reduce the resolution on the surface. We can go in here and modify the size real quick. And actually, let's make the brush a little bit larger and kind of modify the resolution in areas where we don't need it. And if I'm going to stick with a triangle-based mesh, you might as well reduce the resolution where you don't need it. If you go to a quad-based mesh, let's say you want to take this, then put it in Mudbox and retopologize it, then it's really less relevant. You might as well get the detail where you want it and then retopologize it. The retopology process obviously will take a little bit longer that way, but that's really a one-time kind of thing. So let's you also have a brush in here called adaptive reduction, which will only reduce in the areas where there's no surface detail, which is a very useful way of maintaining resolution. You can also add resolution in areas where you want it, and you can see how fast that kind of adds the resolution across the head that way. We also might want to sculpt with some of this, like I go into a drag mode and click drag, and you can see that we're in a volume kind of mode right now. This is a volume brush. Up here you can see there's a volume switch versus a surface switch. And if I click drag, it adds the resolution and dynamically tessellates up to whatever resolution I want to introduce the new details on the surface. I can also go in here and turn on something like a symmetry. So we can do this on both sides, and you can see how quickly and how seamlessly this kind of adds the detail that I want. So maybe I want to add some detail here, do something like this, something like that. You get the idea. Just grab any of these brushes and start to manipulate the surface, and it will dynamically up-res to accommodate the shapes that you're requiring. Okay, so I'm going to undo some of this and get into the mesh mixing functionality. So under Meshmixer, you can see there are a whole bunch of preset meshes. These are just some of the meshes that might be useful. Maybe these are not useful and you want your own mesh. But I'm going to use a mesh in here that looks like an ear. And if I kind of position my character the right way, I can click and drag that ear directly onto my character. So we get some manipulators here to kind of position that ear on the surface. You can move it pretty much anywhere. If you want to put it right on top of the eye, his forehead, whatever, you can do that. You can go in here and rescale this to a much larger ear, have the jawline kind of transition into the earlobe, maybe a little bit lower, quite a large ear, maybe transition into some twisting and rotational controls to change the orientation of that ear so that it looks correct. Now, if you notice on the left, you get a lot of numerical values for these operations. And when you're done, you can go ahead and accept that. If I want to do this on the other side, we could just go ahead and flip this mesh and grab that same ear. There it is, and drag it in there and maybe rotate this. And as you can see that there's only one orientation to this ear, which is incorrect for the side that we're working on. So what we can do is we can just flip the mesh and then rotate this into space, make it a little bit larger, find the point where I want this compared to the other side. Slight asymmetry is probably nice. There's quite a bit of asymmetry in the face as it is, so I kind of want that to continue in the ears, and also apply a little bit of a an orientation and a rotational angle that makes sense. So once I'm done with that, I can accept that too. And now we can jump back into our sculpt brushes and select a smoothing brush, like a bubble smooth or a robust smooth. That helps us transition, let's say we'll do a bubble smooth here, that helps us transition the ear into, and in this case, let's use maybe a surface smooth. So we're not really sculpting or changing the volume of the surface, but rather we're just blending the surface of the ear into the surface of the head. And you can see that it kind of helps me. It did the other side too because I have mirroring turned on. Helps me transition the mesh into the main mesh of the head. So once we're done with this, we can export this. And if I export this mesh, I'll go into a O2 head mesh mix. That is the finished result. And then I can bring this in here as a new mesh where we open the 2015 folder under Meshmixer. We're going to just jump into this second file here where we get the mesh that we just created in Meshmixer, and we can continue on in Mudbox. So at this point, I'd like to just simply do a retopo. We can go into retopology and say new operation, maybe give it a name. Again, I'll keep the name and the operation the same name. I'm going to go ahead and set this to 1000. Target-based face count, a face uniformity of something like 0.8, 0.9. We'll just transfer the sculpted detail and retopologize. This is going to take a minute, and so I'm going to jump a little bit in the demo and come back to you in a sec. Okay, and so we're back here. It's about a minute later or so, and you can see that if I deselect the model, we get a nice quad layout now. There it is. We haven't used any guidelines or anything to control or constrain how the flow of the geometry runs across the face. I can jump down the resolution to the base mesh or go back up. You can see that on the bottom right we have 4 levels, and currently we're at the highest level. If I turn on off the mesh, you can see the detail, and we can continue sculpting. So there's a quick way to kind of slap things onto your character if you have a library of objects that you can use through Meshmixer. You can dress up your characters or your objects that way very quickly. So the last thing I'd like to show you guys here is a tool that was added in the 2014 extension release, and then we did a little bit more work on it in 2015. So you can see this this vehicle is one of the vehicles that we've been using in the content to show off a lot of the new stuff, the 2015 stuff in all the other products as well. And what I'd like to do is get into the caliper tool and show you some of the improvements. So the caliper tool is essentially a way to measure between 2 points on a surface. You can click and click, it'll give you a distance. So with this release, you can actually increase or decrease the number of segments to kind of break this up into units that might be relevant. You can also turn on always visible. So as I'm going to different tools like sculpting tools, you can see that that caliper tool, that caliper measurement, continues to sit on the surface. And if I go back to my tool, it reactivates it, so I can continue to manipulate this by grabbing it and placing it elsewhere on both sides, either side or both sides. The other thing that I could do now is turn on the switch called Stick on the Surface. And so if I were to select my caliper tool and maybe click up here, like kind of the center of that engine cowling, and then do the same thing on the other side, it'll give you a distance. But then I can jump into a sculpt tool and say sculpt, and maybe on a sculpt layer, we'll create a sculpt layer, and I'll also turn on local mirroring. So if I now go in and mirror, as well as sculpt, you can see that I'm mirroring the sculpting on the other side, and on both sides of my model it is kind of tracking, it's kind of taking that caliper measurement, that dimensioning tool, along with it. So as it's deforming, it'll stick on the surface. So those are some of the improvements there. The other thing that I can do now is if I have a curve on the surface, I can set a sensitivity distance, a kind of a snapping distance of 40, and maybe click towards the beginning here and then click somewhere along the curve. And not only will it measure a direct distance, it will also measure the arc length along the curve. And so on your little tag here, you get two measurements. So that's pretty much all I have for you guys. Thank you very much for attending today. I hope that was useful, and have a great day.